Before the sun rose on June 6, 1944, thousands of young Americans stood packed inside dark landing craft, listening to the engine noise and the sound of waves hitting steel, holding letters from home and thinking about towns and faces far away, knowing that in minutes the doors would drop and history would demand everything from them. Because this morning was not just another battle, it was a single chance to break Hitler's grip on Europe, and if it failed, the war could stretch on for years, turning this narrow strip of French coast into the place where the future of the world either moved forward or stopped cold. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, while most of occupied Europe slept under German control, the largest invasion force in history moved quietly across the English Channel, a vast armada of more than 5,000 ships carrying American, British, and Canadian troops toward the coast of Normandy. The American share of that force made up of young men from farms, cities, and small towns across the United States who had trained for months in England, rehearsing landings on cold beaches and memorizing maps of places they had never seen, all for this moment that planners called Operation Overlord, a plan born from years of debate among Allied leaders who understood that defeating Nazi Germany required opening a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union and strike directly at Hitler's occupied territories. And now, after delays caused by weather and secrecy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had given the final order, telling the troops that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere marched with them, and as American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions boarded their planes late on June 5th, they carried heavy equipment, extra ammunition, and instructions to jump behind enemy lines to secure roads, bridges, and causeways, knowing that their mission was to clear the way for the beach landings that would follow. And as the aircraft crossed the channel after midnight, they ran into thick clouds and German anti-aircraft fire that scattered formations and dropped many paratroopers far from their intended zones, leaving small groups of Americans landing in flooded fields and hedgerows, struggling in the dark to find one another. Yet, even in confusion, they moved forward, cutting phone lines, seizing villages like Sainte-Mère-Église, and disrupting German defenses, while out at sea, the main invasion force pressed on through rough water that left many soldiers seasick inside their landing craft. Men from units like the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division gripping rifles and helmets, listening to brief prayers and quiet words, knowing that the beaches ahead were named Utah and Omaha for the Americans, each with its own challenges. Utah Beach on the western flank defended more lightly, Omaha Beach guarded by high bluffs, concrete bunkers, and experienced German troops from the 352nd Infantry Division. And as dawn approached, Allied naval guns opened fire, sending shells toward the coast in an effort to weaken German positions, while waves of bombers passed overhead, though smoke, cloud cover, and uncertainty meant many bombs missed their targets, leaving much of the German defensive network intact. And when the first American landing craft reached Utah Beach shortly after 6:30 a.m., strong currents pushed them south of their intended landing zones, a mistake that could have caused chaos, but instead placed them in a less heavily defended area, where Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of a former president, landed with the first wave despite his age and health, calmly assessed the situation, and decided they would start the war from right there, a choice that helped turn potential disaster into progress, as American units pushed inland, secured exits, and linked up with airborne troops, gradually building momentum on that stretch of coast, while miles to the east at Omaha Beach, the scene unfolding was far more grim, as American soldiers approached the shore under fire that planners had hoped would be reduced by bombardment, but instead, many German positions remained active, overlooking a wide beach broken by obstacles, mine stakes, and steel barriers, and when the ramps dropped on the landing craft, soldiers from the 1st and 29th Divisions stepped into deep water under intense fire, their plans immediately disrupted as units became separated and officers were lost. Yet, amid confusion, small groups pressed forward, taking shelter behind
behind beach obstacles and shingle, trying to find ways off the exposed sand, while naval crews risked their ships by moving closer to shore to provide direct fire support, and medics worked under pressure to help the wounded, using only what they could carry. And as the morning wore on, American commanders offshore feared the worst, worried that Omaha might fail entirely, threatening the success of the entire invasion, because D-Day depended on holding all 5 beaches, linking them together and building a steady flow of men and supplies into France, and without that foothold, the Allied plan to liberate Western Europe could collapse. Yet even as casualties mounted and progress seemed slow, individual acts of leadership and determination began to change the situation, as soldiers climbed the bluffs using narrow draws, scaling slopes under fire, silencing strong points one by one, opening gaps that allowed more troops to move inland, while news of the landing spread rapidly across the world, with radios in the United States interrupting regular programming to announce that Allied forces had landed in France, families gathering around sets to listen for details, knowing that somewhere on those beaches were sons, brothers, and husbands whose fates were still unknown. And back in Normandy, as the morning advanced, smoke and dust hung over Omaha, the tide rose, and more waves of American troops continued to land, stepping into a battle that was still undecided, the success of the invasion hanging on whether enough men could break through the defenses before German reinforcements arrived, because beyond the beach lay narrow roads, hedgerows, and villages that would become the next battlefield, and as officers looked inland and counted the minutes, they understood that the most dangerous morning in American military history was far from over, and the question remained unanswered as the sun climbed higher over the Normandy coast, whether Omaha Beach would finally give way, or whether this narrow strip of sand would become the place where the invasion stalled and the fate of Europe balanced on a knife's edge.
As the sun rose higher on June 6, 1944, the situation on Omaha Beach slowly shifted from desperation toward fragile control, not through a single sweeping action, but through dozens of small, determined advances made by American soldiers who refused to accept that the beach was the end of the line. And as naval officers brought destroyers dangerously close to shore to fire directly into German positions carved into the bluffs, the pressure on the defenders began to ease just enough for infantry units to move, crawl, and climb, finding narrow paths through minefields and barbed wire. And once a few men reached the top, they began to turn the defenses from behind, forcing German troops to withdraw or surrender, opening routes that allowed more Americans to follow. And by late morning, though Omaha had not yet become secure, it was no longer in danger of total failure, a turning point that Eisenhower and his staff would only fully understand hours later. While at Utah Beach, progress continued more steadily as American forces pushed inland toward the town of Ste. Marie-du-Mont, linking up with airborne units that had fought through the night in scattered groups, many paratroopers still unsure of where they were, but guided by training and mission rather than exact maps, using church steeples, road signs, and the sound of distant fighting to orient themselves. And despite confusion, they achieved their core objectives, securing causeways that allowed troops and vehicles to move off the beach and into the Norman countryside, preventing German counterattacks from reaching the shoreline. And as midday passed, Allied commanders began to see the shape of success emerging, though it came at a high cost and with no certainty about what the next hours would bring, because German forces were still capable of launching strong counterattacks, and inland the terrain itself worked against the Americans, the hedgerows forming natural barriers that limited visibility and movement, turning every field into a potential defensive position. Yet momentum was building, and throughout the afternoon, more men, tanks, and supplies came ashore, engineers clearing obstacles and repairing exits, while medical teams worked tirelessly to care for the wounded, often with limited resources. And offshore, the invasion fleet continued to stretch across the horizon, an unmistakable sign that this was no raid, but a full-scale return to Europe. And as the afternoon light shifted, American units pushed farther inland from Omaha, capturing key roads and high ground, making it increasingly difficult for German commanders to organize a coordinated response, because communication lines had been cut and confusion reigned, many German leaders uncertain whether Normandy was the main invasion or a diversion meant to draw forces away from a larger landing elsewhere, a doubt carefully planted by Allied deception plans that convinced Hitler and his generals that the true invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais.
WWII. And this hesitation proved critical, delaying the release of armored divisions that could have threatened the beachhead during its most vulnerable hours. And as evening approached, Eisenhower received reports confirming that American troops were established on both Utah and Omaha, connected to British and Canadian forces to the east, the beachheads not yet fully secure, but strong enough to hold, meaning that the most dangerous phase of the operation had passed, though the fighting was far from over, because now the challenge shifted from landing to breaking out, from holding a narrow strip of coast to pushing deeper into occupied France, a task that would take weeks of intense combat through villages like Carentan and St. Lo, where progress would be measured in yards rather than miles. And as darkness fell on June 6th, the sounds of battle did not stop, but they changed, becoming smaller, more scattered, as units reorganized, counted losses, and prepared for the next day. Many soldiers digging shallow positions or resting where they stood, exhausted beyond words, while above them the sky filled with Allied aircraft bringing reinforcements and supplies, a steady flow that the Germans could no longer prevent. And back in the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation with a prayer broadcast over the radio, asking for strength for the men fighting far from home and for a just and lasting peace, his words reflecting the understanding that D-Day was not an end, but a beginning. And in the days that followed, the American foothold in Normandy expanded, ports were constructed, supplies poured in, and the long campaign across France began, leading eventually to the liberation of Paris and the steady push toward Germany itself. But all of that future depended on the hours spent on those beaches, on the decisions made by officers and the resolve shown by ordinary soldiers who moved forward despite fear and uncertainty. And when historians later looked back on June 6, 1944, they would describe it as a turning point of the Second World War, the moment when the path to victory in Europe became possible. Not because success was guaranteed, but because on America's most dangerous morning, enough men endured, advanced, and held their ground to change the course of history forever.